All right, young scholars, this is Postmodernism Part 2. I'm going to try to keep it focused on the aspects that are relevant to Slaughterhouse-Five, but also address some of the questions from the reading. And I'm starting with this something very simple, the concept of what is true. On the right is actually Moe from The Simpsons, a cartoon that's been on for longer than most of you have been alive, for something like 10 years, longer than you guys have been alive. Anyway, questions of truth and subjectivity first proposed in modernism. So you may not recall, but one of the things we talked about is one of the things modernism does in terms of its sort of the change in the way people are thinking is losing this sense of an absolute or an objective truth that can be discovered through either reason and science or an objective truth of God for us to discover through religion. Modernism started to focus on nothing but subjective truths. We saw that as part of existentialism, that there's only your particular truth and mine. There's not some third objective truth that could resolve and show us that I'm wrong and you're right. We saw that represented in the way Faulkner wrote his novel. There was no objective voice telling the story. We had to sort things out from each character's subjective truth through their point of view as we shifted points of view. It illustrates the modern idea that there isn't, again, an objective truth. At the end of that novel, we're left with just the different subjective points of view. All right, now, what does this mean that it gave rise to the belief in multiple truths and multiple subjectivities? Well, what they mean is when the modernists were thinking in these terms, they thought there was sort of a universal experience that we all had, certain components. We all feel isolated. We all seek love. We all need to sort of attain self-actualization, whatever ideas. And of course, you might notice that existentialism might counter some of that, but that there were there were shared universal experiences as a human being, and then we had our subjective view of the world from that point. The multiple truths, multiple subjectivities, kind of moves that from this universal idea and says, well, maybe the subjective experience of someone in a modern European or American Western civilization is not the same as it might be for people coming from an Asian culture or African culture or South America. So there isn't, so the multiple subjectivities are, okay, you have your individual subjective experience, but then you might also, that your individuality might exist in a culture where, say for instance, in the East, there's generally considered less of a focus on the individual, more on the group. So if you grow up in a culture where the group is more important than the individual, your personal subjective experience is going to be different than, say, the subjective experience of a European or an American. The starting point, the framework in which it happens. This is why we also have the argument also could be applied to things like marginalized groups. So if you're a woman in America, historically speaking, you've been marginalized. Your experience is completely different. And the argument here is that you're not coming from the same place as your subjectivity is then also in the framework of being a part of your gender, right? This is the thing that kind of ultimately leads to multiculturalism, right? So where we start to say, okay, a bunch of Europeans and Americans are writing about the subjective nature of experience, agreeing that there's no reality, only interpretations of reality. But they're ignoring that they're saying there's this core universal experience that all humans have, and that gender and culture and race don't matter. Multiculturalism or postmodernism takes into account some of those things. Right? That's a real quick view of it. Now, one of the other aspects of this, the questions of truth, is the idea, and this was in your article, of grand narratives or master narratives. And this is one that I want to tie to Vonnegut. So the purpose of these is to maintain totality, stability, and order. Um, Basically, I'm going to skip past that right now, but basically it's a story. The culture tells itself about its practices and beliefs. So for example, this is directly from the article, American culture might be the story that democracy is the most enlightened and rational form of government, and that democracy can and will lead to universal human happiness. All right, so that's the big sort of framework. You don't necessarily talk about that. It's built into your thinking already. You grew up in a world where democracy was considered these things. Within that, then you have your opinions. Which is the best political party? What is the best approach to running a nation or an economy? But you're still in the background. The framework in which you have that argument or those opinions is still that democracy is the most enlightened or rational form of government. Right? It's the story you grew up with. Okay, the idea here is every belief system or ideology has its grand narrative. So even the counter for it, Marxism, counter to not democracy but capitalism, the grand narrative is the idea that capitalism will collapse on itself and a utopian socialist world will evolve. The reason they bring up Marxism is that's where the concept of ideology comes from, or its real focus there. So in other words, well, we won't get into that one too much, but even something like Marxism, which says capitalism is a problem, it has this overall story that capitalism is going to collapse anyway. So then Marx tries to come up with a solution, right? Grand narratives are kind of meta theory or meta ideology. Meta means, in this case, sort of outside of or surrounding your personal ideology. So you could have your own view of the world, but it's still going to happen within the framework of the world you grew up in. And an idea. So in other words, Marx's ideology that power is in the hands of those with capital, and it should be taken by the workers. That all works within a framework that he probably had of something about human nature and economic systems. Let me try to let's see if this next one is a better example. So directly relating it to Vonnegut, one narrative I think we can agree is most of us think of World War II as a clear struggle of good versus evil. There's probably that's not the biggest narrative though. That happens within the grand narrative that America and Western civilization, well, probably for us just America, is the greatest country, that it provides the greatest good. Its people are treated fairly, and you can make life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's the story arc of America is that we founded ourselves, we created democracy in the modern world. We had a few blips where we had to end slavery, but for the most part, we're on a positive, forward-moving path. Most of us think of America as something that is moving on a path toward an arc of justice, so to speak. Right? That might not be a narrative in another country, in Italy or something. You have more of a history and a shared culture by everybody, and it doesn't think of itself as this experiment, right? So America is a country of good people with a good governing concept. It has maybe Christian values that help inform its morality. It has rugged individualism, but it can pull together to solve its problems. That's the big grand narrative. And so then World War II, when America goes in, interestingly enough, I always thought America did most of the work in World War II, but maybe you guys are getting a different history now, where you find out that actually Russia lost more people by a long shot and had fought a lot of the war. But my very simple version when I was a kid was that America came in, kicked some butt, we were nothing but good. And Vonnegut starts to undermine that. We haven't gotten to this part, but there's a quote from Billy Pilgrim where he says, "I myself have seen the bodies of schoolgirls who were boiled alive in a water tower by my own countrymen, who were proud of fighting pure evil at the time." So his countrymen here have this sense that they're proud and they're fighting pure evil, but they're doing evil. And World War II especially is sort of this black and white war. Once you get to the 1960s, you have something like Vietnam, and pretty much every war after that, even after any war after World War II, there's always been these gray areas. Should we be there? What are we doing? Were we the good guys or were we invaders? Should we have gone into Iraq? All of those things didn't apply really to World War II. There were, in fact, actually anti-war movements, but most of that stuff is sort of buried. We think of ourselves as the good guys. We don't. Now, one of the reasons Vonnegut is doing this is he experienced Dresden, he came home, and for 20 years, as he mentions at the beginning of the book, while he's trying to research his book, there's no mention of Dresden. So he had this experience of the bombing of Dresden, which was Allied forces bombing an undefended city with no military value. That doesn't quite fit the narrative of America as the good guys or even the Allied forces. We don't go and shoot, we don't bomb innocent people. We fight a war because we have to. We're not invaders, we're not conquerors, we are justice. So he sees this event and he comes home and it's not reported, it's actually covered up because the narrative that needs to be preserved is that it was a clear struggle of good versus evil. If the Allied forces do something that doesn't fit that, it becomes problematic. We like a simple, clear narrative at that point, right? So Vonnegut's element of postmodernism here is poking holes in the bigger story. Even bigger than that, I call this one biblical, historical, cultural. I'm not landing on one thing here, but the concept of humans having free will and are the sum of our choices is very much built into America, probably more so than anywhere else, because we really lean into our individualism more than others. And the idea here is, and you've gotten to this point where the aliens who see time the way that actually, and this is something we'll look at, but the way that modern physics actually says time is, which is that it doesn't move forward, it just is past, present, and future all at the same time. If that's the case, you're not really making decisions. And the chapter you read ends with, if I haven't spent so much time studying Earthlings, I wouldn't have any idea what was meant by free will. He's poking a hole with his aliens in a very fundamental idea that we have, which really most psychology, if you're taking a psych class, almost every movement in psychology from Freud till now is talking about things that influence our choices that are not part of our free will, our unconscious mind, our brain chemicals, our childhoods, as well as the concept of physics, where if that's the nature of time, we're not really making choices. So where does the idea, at least in Western civilization, come from? The idea of free will come from? It really comes from that Adam and Eve story. They were the creatures that had choice. They made the wrong choice and got kicked out. But even if you're not religious, that's part of our cultural narrative that we make choices, that we have free will. That's why you can't, if you get arrested for committing a crime, you can't say my mommy didn't love me enough, or I didn't have, my serotonin levels were down, and this is how I behave. Ultimately, even if we do excuse a lot of behavior or understand it psychologically, we don't. That's not built into our legal system, which is a reflection of our values. So these are some examples of grand narratives, bigger stories into which our stories fit. So like when you tell your life story, you're telling, you wouldn't even notice, but you'd be telling a story where you have free will. Your story is your story of choices you've made. Your story doesn't really fit into, doesn't reference World War II, but you do think that you live in a good country that does good things, probably. Maybe not as simplistically good as we used to think, right? Because you are postmodern kids. I got to pause here because we only have 15 minutes for each video. I didn't get to the book. I'm going to see if I can make a chapter 4 video, but I'll tell you what to do after this little bit of postmodernism later.